This episode of Monster Memories is brought to you by Fangoria Magazine, the greatest horror magazine in the genre since 1979. For 20% off your magazine and merch orders, use the promo code DEADNOISEBLOG at checkout when you visit shop.fangoria.com. When I was really young, I had an unhealthy and irrational fear of werewolves. When I first saw the TV special of the Goosebumps story The Werewolf of Fever Swamp, I was so scared that I was convinced that werewolves were real and that I was gonna get killed by one. Thankfully, I grew out of believing they were real pretty quickly, but I was still scared by them when I would see them in movies. Even now, when I watch a werewolf movie for the first time, some of that childhood fear comes back for a second before I finally snap out of it. Now, if there's anything to know about me if you don't know already, it's that the classic Universal monster movies are some of my all-time favorites, so it's probably no surprise when I say that with all the werewolf movies that I've seen over the years, the original Wolfman from 1941 continues to be my favorite. In my first Monster Memories video, I talked about how Dracula from 1931 was a tremendous time capsule of a film in terms of filmmaking, special effects, and even world history, and part of what makes The Wolfman so great is that it possesses those same qualities. Released just a few days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the film is often seen as an allegory to the events of the Second World War. The screenwriter Kurt Siodmak was Jewish and living in Germany in the late 1930s, and he fled to the United States in 1937 to escape the anti-Semitic tyranny of the time. He wrote The Wolfman as a metaphor for what it was like to be a Jewish person in Europe during those years, calling the film quote-unquote the story of an outsider whose destiny was cursed by the forces he could not control. A statement that also answers the question of why the movie's working title was Destiny before being changed to The Wolfman. From a filmmaking perspective, I love to watch The Wolfman as a double feature with the original Dracula because they come from the same era of classic horror, but they also manage to exhibit polar opposite ends of the spectrum. Dracula was made at a time where sound was a novelty in cinema, which explains the long stretches of silence that happened throughout the movie. It was also a very laid-back film in terms of special effects and overall spectacle. The Wolfman came 10 years later, and it was a step up in production value compared to the 1931 vampire classic. For starters, the set design is literally otherworldly, from the town square exteriors to the gypsy village to the foggy woods where everything hits the fan. A lot of these exteriors were recycled sets from previous Universal films, but it just feels like they were tailor-made for the Wolfman because of how well they fit in the environment the film was trying to build. As far as special effects go, the look of the werewolf came from the legendary makeup artist Jack Pierce, who's best known as the Universal Monster Maker, for his contributions in several of the studio's horror films of the time. Using yak hair and spirit gum, Jack Pierce took 4 to 6 hours to turn Lon Chaney Jr. into the Wolfman, and it took an hour to an hour and a half to take the makeup off. For Chaney Jr., the makeup was very uncomfortable, and having to sit still for several hours wasn't a fun experience, which caused some tensions to arise between the actor and the makeup artist despite their mutual respect and admiration of each other's work. As iconic as the film is some 80 years after its release, The Wolfman is missing some key elements of a modern werewolf film, with the two biggest examples being a shot of the full moon and a full transformation sequence. Now, there is a moment in the movie where Chaney Jr.'s character does shift from man to werewolf, but not a lot of it is shown on screen. There are interesting shots of his face towards the end of the film that shows the werewolf makeup gradually being taken off bit by bit, and the visual effect of it feeling like a continuous sequence was achieved by a series of cross dissolves between each shot after the makeup crew would remove each piece of the makeup. And this effect might not look like anything extravagant by today's standards, but for 1941 that was revolutionary. And as cool as the werewolf looks and as awesome as the scenes with him are, I find the most memorable and effective scenes in the movie to be the human interactions. There's a huge psychological element where the audience isn't sure if Lawrence Talbot is actually a werewolf or if everything's in his imagination, and I find those scenes in which he's paranoid about what he may or may not become to be more interesting than when he actually becomes the werewolf. It's also worth mentioning that this movie wouldn't be what it is without the fantastic cast it has. First things first, the title character is played by Lon Chaney Jr., whose father, Lon Chaney Sr., made a name for himself in the early 1900s as the Man of a Thousand Faces, and just one of the greatest actors to ever live. And Chaney Jr.'s performance as Lawrence Talbot is so convincing that it's easy to feel bad for his character as the film progresses and he seems to spiral further into insanity. There's also some horror movie royalty that make appearances as well, with the Invisible Man himself, Claude Rains, playing as Lawrence Talbot's father, and Bela Lugosi, the man, the myth, the legend, being the gypsy who also happens to be the werewolf that passed on the curse to Larry Talbot. However, one of the standout actors and characters of the entire film is Evelyn Ankers as Gwen Conliffe, who sells Larry the Wolfhead cane and tells him about the folklore of werewolves at the beginning of the movie. The chemistry between their two characters on screen is like nothing else, and as much as I enjoy their individual scenes, the scenes with the two of them together are some of my favorites in the entire movie. Offset, Chaney Jr. and Ankers were amicable for the most part, and they had a mutual respect for each other, but Chaney Jr. also really liked to pull pranks on her when he was in the werewolf makeup once he found out that she'd get scared pretty easily, and she wasn't a very big fan of that, naturally, but thankfully none of their off-screen antics or attitudes affected the connection of their characters in the movie. There have been a litany of werewolf movies to come out in the decades after The Wolfman, but very few have been able to replicate the monster magic and overall feeling of internal dread that this movie captures, even 81 years later. Was it the first werewolf movie ever made? Not exactly. There were a couple shorts and feature-length films in the early 1900s that came before it, and the most popular example of a full-length movie is Universal's Werewolf of London from 1935. But there's just something special about The Wolfman. Maybe it's the cast, maybe it's the early effects, maybe it's a combination of elements, but here's what it was for me. Like I said at the beginning, I was terrified of werewolves when I was very young, and I grew out of it quickly, thank God. But I was still a little kid when I saw The Wolfman for the first time, and even though I was young enough for it to still give me the creeps, I was also aware enough to realize it was just a movie, and I found myself more intrigued than anything else. I really liked how the werewolf looked and I thought it was really cool, and I like to imagine all the time and work it took to bring that monster to life. What I'm trying to say is that while it might not be as shocking as it was in the 1940s, it's one of those movies that's accessible enough for all ages and can be used as a reference for teaching people about the horror genre. I'm a huge advocate of never forgetting the classics and giving the OGs credit at every opportunity, and I feel like more people need to adopt that mindset, especially with these old black and white monster movies. Maybe they're old, maybe the pace is different from modern films, but there's still a lot to learn from them, and while I love every era of horror cinema, nothing beats the classics for that exact reason. So that's everything I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Check out my Substack page if you want to hear more from me about horror movies and or rock music, my two favorite things. And for even more monster and metal talk, follow me on Twitter and Instagram at DeadNoiseBlog. Thanks again, and until the next video, stay tuned, stay scared, and I'll talk to you later.